If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel, as well as follow me and subscribe to me on all my other social media platforms. What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and I am back with another discography ranking for you guys. It's been about a month and a half since I did the Avenged Sevenfold ranking, and, well, we talked about a modern mainstream band last time. Now let's talk about a classic underground band, and quite possibly the most infamous and controversial band in not just metal, but music as a whole, and that is, of course, the pioneers of Norwegian black metal, Mayhem. So yeah, this is a one I've wanted to do just to kind of talk about the backstory, as well as the albums, and just pretty much the whole lore of Mayhem, as they are the pioneers of a whole scene, which, without this band, who knows what Norwegian metal in general would be like, you know? So, how I first became aware of Mayhem, I remember I was a teenager and I watched on VH1 Classic, it was airing at the time, the Metal Headbanger's Journey documentary, which, yeah, you had the funny yet infamous interview gone wrong with Necrobutcher on there where he tells Sam Dunn, "Fuck you!" You know what I mean? Excuse me, and also, apologies in advance if I'm coughing a lot in this video. I'm still kind of fighting a bit of pollen here where I am, but just a little heads up. But I just wanted to get this video out for you guys. But yeah, there was that, and then talking about one very key member in the history of Mayhem later in that documentary, and I'll go in depth about that in just a little bit. But as far as like how I got into them musically, I listened to the song Freezing Moon on YouTube and I thought, holy shit, this sounds evil and it sounds badass. And then I got into the debut album, then I went back and checked out their early stuff, and then kind of got caught up with their last album that came out a few years ago. But yeah, we're going to talk about 6 studio full-lengths and 2 EPs, and a bunch of extracurriculars in between. But without further ado, let's get started with the history. So, we kick things off as the band formed in Oslo, Norway in 1984, originally under the name Musta, but would later, shortly afterwards, change their name to Mayhem, after hearing the Venom song, Mayhem with Mercy. Now, the original lineup consisted of Jorn Stubberud, otherwise known as Necrobutcher, on bass, Kjell Mannheim, who would just go by his last name of Mannheim, or Mannheim, however you want to pronounce it, and Øystein Arseth, otherwise known as Euronymous, on guitars. So they would just be a 3-piece for a little while, basically starting out as more of a punk band, doing like Motorhead covers, Venom covers, Dead Kennedys covers, just kind of finding their way a little bit. And then you fast forward a couple of years to around 1986, they began releasing demoed material of stuff that they were writing original material, and also getting demos from so many other bands around the world. Kind of like this big international tape trading network scene going on in Norway. Now, eventually they would be joined by 2 different vocalists, Erik Nornheim, otherwise known as Messiah, and Sven Erik Christensen, otherwise known as Maniac. They would both kind of help the band out here and there for different shows, different demos, different tracks, all sorts of stuff. And then they would actually go into the studio to record their debut EP, released in 1987. We get Death Crush. Death Crush is a very raw, very grisly sounding EP. After all, it started out as a demo, but then it became released as an EP through a label called Poser Corpse Records. This EP in my overall Mayhem ranking is my number 4. I love how energetic and raw and just nasty this EP sounds. Of course, this was the beginning of Norwegian black metal right here with this EP. Granted, musically, there is a lot of kin to early death metal and even a little bit of the emerging grindcore sound that was starting out with Napalm Death, among many other bands in that British scene in particular. But yeah, definitely has some early death metal vibes on here, which I'll talk about more about that when we talk more about Euronymous when we get to the crazy shit here in just a little bit. But yeah, these songs, it's like, yeah, they're sloppy, but that's kind of what's cool about it. It's that, yeah, it's sloppy, but who cares? The songs are just fun and energetic. The title track, Chainsaw Gutsfuck, featuring some of the most brutal lyrics that you have ever read. Necrolust, Pure Fucking Armageddon, which was a hell of a closing track. I mean, just really good tracks for under 20 minutes. This was some energetic stuff, so yeah, my number 4 Mayhem release overall. However, after the release of Death Crush, we got lineup changes. Both Maniac and Messiah would leave the band, and also Mannheim would leave the band, leaving spots open for vocals and drums. Now, they would get their vocalist first, and this lineup change would pretty much start a chain of events in the entire Norwegian black metal scene. They would pick up Per Yngve Pelle Olin, otherwise known as Dead, who came from Sweden and came out of the band Morbid. He would join the band on vocals, and basically how they discovered him, the Morbid demo, December Moon, was sent to the guys from Mayhem, and they found the tape with a crucified mouse. Because, well, Pelle was a very strange human being. After all, nearly died as a child, and either whatever stories out there, whether he was bullied as a child or an ice skating accident, either or he ended up with a ruptured spleen that nearly killed him, and it never left him. So he was just basically fascinated by the concept of death. But he would join the band on vocals, and then later on in 1988, they would get Jan Axel Bloomberg, otherwise known as Hellhammer, on drums. And I'd say that was a huge upgrade. I mean, Mannheim's drumming on Death Crush was energetic, but Hellhammer, I mean, he's one of the best drummers in metal history. Like, the guy can play anything and everything. So yeah, this would be the lineup of the band for the next few years, from 1988 through 1991, where they began rehearsing and doing some new songs, playing live in Norway, and even doing the Live in Leipzig live album in Leipzig, Germany in 1990. However, it would be around this time where the band really started to see how bizarre Dead truly was. And then, of course, the big part that not a lot of people talk about, towards the end, both Dead and Euronymous began to get on each other's nerves quite a good bit. All coming to a head on April 8th, 1991. I believe April 8th, but if not, if not April 8th, early April 1991, Per Olin committed suicide in the band's rehearsal house in Krokstad. And it was a very brutal suicide, apparently, like slitting his wrists, his throat, and also while bleeding, writing the suicide note with at the end saying, "Excuse all the blood," and writing lyrics for a song that I'll talk about in a little bit. And then ended it all with a shotgun blast right to the head. And Euronymous came to the house and saw everything that happened, and instead of calling the police, he decides to go and get a disposable camera to take pictures of the dead body and staging it for so much other crap. And in fact, sorry for the chair squeak. In fact, one of those photos that was staged by Euronymous ended up on the cover of this bootleg live album, Dawn of the Black Hearts, which would come out in 1995. But we don't count that because it's a bootleg live album. Now, don't ever count those in discography rankings. But then, after calling the police, and then Hellhammer and Necrobutcher find out what Euronymous had done, and Necrobutcher basically wanted nothing more to do with Euronymous as a result of all that, and Necrobutcher flat out left the band in 1991. And then, so after the departure of Necrobutcher, you only had Euronymous and Hellhammer left, so they needed a new bassist and vocalist. And they would pick up someone that could do both. Stian Johansson, otherwise known as Occultus, would take over on both bass and vocals, but didn't stay in the band for very long after receiving death threats from Euronymous, which kind of became a big thing with Euronymous. Now, one important note to mention about After Dead Suicide, Euronymous then began his egomaniacal, megalomaniac power trip, where he was basically what created modern metal elitism that I absolutely hate. And I go more in depth about this in my rant about metal gatekeepers and metal elitists video, but choice cuts, basically Euronymous tried to say that Dead killed himself because black metal became too trendy and commercial. Yet, according to close friends of Dead, Dead had always had his sights set on making Mayhem being a successful metal band. Like, he was thinking long-term business-wise for the band and hoped that other bands within metal can reach success of some sort. So, yeah, Euronymous, big fucking liar. But then after Occultus left, then we really get into some craziness. Euronymous would end up opening the record shop Helvetta, which sold mostly extreme metal releases, particularly in black metal and death metal, which again, because Euronymous tried making a stance saying that death metal was for posers and it was too commercial, which all that is bullshit. And Euronymous knew it, but he wanted to make himself look like, oh, he's this god of the dark, or whatever, and it was fucking stupid. So, yeah, that's for you, Euronymous. I don't care if you're dead. But anyways, I digress. So after the Helvetta shop opened up, then in 1992 comes along this one Norwegian kid named Christian Vikernes, otherwise known as Varg, otherwise known as Count Grishnak, who had his own solo project called Burzum, which Varg would hand the tape over to Euronymous, and Euronymous dug it and decided, you know what? I'll bring you onto my Death Like Silence production label and get your debut out. Which, it happened, and then began the slow power struggle between Varg and Euronymous. And of course, in the meantime of all this, Varg, being the Antichrist that he is, decides to go and burn churches down in Norway and doing all sorts of stupid, crazy shit. All coming to a head in August of 1993, where, by this point, Varg and Euronymous butting heads, trying to take control of the, quote, black metal inner circle, and basically went completely wrong. And then the tipping points, apparently Euronymous, who knows how true it is, because the story's changed so many times, but if I can find the truth somewhere in the middle, Varg caught wind of Euronymous saying that he planned to kill Varg and make a snuff film out of it. And then, of course, the bigger tipping point was the contract between Burzum and Death Like Silence Productions, where pretty much Euronymous fucked Varg over for money and licensing rights to his music, and then eventually Euronymous had just had enough of Varg and decided to try and make peace with Varg by sending over the rights of Burzum back to Varg and do whatever he wants. And then Varg decided to take a trip all the way from Bergen to Oslo, which was 500 plus kilometers, and riding along with Varg would be another new member of Mayhem, and that was Snorre Rook, otherwise known as Blackthorn, who also had his own band called Thorns. And then also in the meantime, they were recording their debut album and also picking up Attila Chihar from the cult black metal band from Hungary, Tormentor, which had to have been really cool for them to get him to do vocals for this debut, but we'll talk more about that in just a moment. But back to the big shit. So Varg makes it to Oslo to Euronymous' apartment, and basically what ensues is a flat-out murder. Varg kills Euronymous by stabbing him over almost 24 times. And of course, Varg's story about it has changed over the years. He tried claiming self-defense. However, it's difficult to prove that without a corroborating witness to everything, as well as it's super biased on Varg's part because he was the one that committed the murder. And on top of that, Varg even admits in interviews that it turns out Euronymous didn't have any of this stuff that he planned to kill Varg with, like an electroshock pistol or whatever the hell. But yeah, in the end, Euronymous is dead. Varg thinks he gets away with it, but ends up being caught by the police. And then Varg would end up being sentenced to 21 years in prison in Norway for the murder, as well as church burnings. Ended up serving 15 years as he was released in 2009. Meanwhile, Snorre would end up serving time in prison as an accessory or an accomplice to the death of Euronymous. And pretty much after the death of Euronymous, like Attila, he was gone. He had lost pretty much all contact with the rest of the guys. Snorre in prison, Varg in prison, and Euronymous was dead, leaving only Hellhammer left in the band. Shortly after the death of Euronymous, Hellhammer decided to hook back up with Necrobutcher, who was actually already in a band with Maniac, their original vocalist, and they decided to kind of try and bring everything back together and get Mayhem back going, and would decide to release posthumously after the album was recorded on and off for a year, from the summer of 1992 through the spring of 1993, finally released, and now we talk about the studio output. Finally released in 1994, we get the debut album, De Mysteriis Dom Satanis. Already, this is my number one album. I mean, how could it not be? After all, yeah, tragic backstory. The most tragic backstory of any album in the history of metal or even music as a whole, with all the crazy stuff. But listen to all the personnel that had involvement on this album. You had Euronymous and Blackthorn do the recorded guitars. Necrobutcher did a lot of songwriting. Dead writing pretty much all of the lyrics. You had Varg doing the recorded bass, Hellhammer the recorded drums, and Attila recorded vocals. So you have 7 big players in some way, shape, or form doing stuff on this album. But yeah, De Mysteriis, it's still an all-time classic black metal album. Definitely a top 5 black metal album in the history of the genre, and I don't think it's the best black metal album out of Norway. I think there's a couple of other albums that are a little bit better, but it doesn't take away from the fact that this is an amazing album. Top to bottom, like, it's fast-paced, it's brutal, it's evil. I mean, from Funeral Fog all the way to the title track, there's nothing I can find to complain about. Buried by Time and Dust, if I were to try and coin the term brutal black metal, that might be one of the earliest songs, because it is a flat-out brutal onslaught of a track. Freezing Moon ends up on here. Shocked the song Carnage wasn't on this album. I wish that could have been on here. But the song Life Eternal, which is an amazing song, does have the lyrics that Dead wrote in the Suicide Note. But just top to bottom, amazing songs. Nothing to complain about. Even the production, even though it's lo-fi, it sounds great. Like, every instrument's fairly even kiltered. The vocals are well done. Now, I know Attila's vocals is definitely the big dividing line for a lot of fans with this album. I personally think Attila is the best vocalist that Mayhem has ever had, because he's more experimental, doesn't do the prototypical black metal scream. Like, he can do it just as well as anybody else, if not better. But he's trying, like, almost like throat singing, dark opera, even death growls. Like, he's trying all sorts of stuff, and I think this is definitely his best vocal performance ever, I would say. But yeah, De Mysterious, my number 1. So, after the release of De Mysterious, Necrobutcher, Hellhammer, and Maniac decide, well, if we're going to continue, we need to find another guitarist. And they would eventually pick up Rune Eriksson, otherwise known as Blasphemer, who was already in the band Ara Noir, which is a legendary black and thrash metal band. Blasphemer decides to join Mayhem, and this would be pretty much the lineup for the next decade, as these 4 gentlemen would work together over the next 10 or so years, and would actually go back to the studio sometime in 1997, and then later on released in 1997, we get the second EP, and the last EP I'm talking about, Wolf's Lair Abyss. This is my number 5 Mayhem release. I really like this. I would say in terms of songwriting, you could see like a bit of an evolution in Mayhem's songwriting chops, because this was sort of the beginning of their avant-garde, dare I say, proggy era that we're about to get into for the next few albums. But still, it's sinister sounding. Actually, this would be produced by Garm from Oliver, who is a legendary musician in Norway in general. But yeah, he would be the producer of this EP and did a really good job at maintaining grit and sinister tones, but making it sound audible, kind of just like De Mysterious a little bit, except maybe a little more gritty. But the song I wanted to talk the most about, Ancient Skin. Like, geez, that song just has so much going on. And it's definitely one of the more brutal Mayhem tracks, but also musically versatile tracks in Mayhem's entire discography. But yeah, my number 5 for overall Mayhem. Excuse me. So, after Wolf's Lair Abyss, the band began to tour all across the globe, and then sometime in 1999, heading into 2000, they would actually get picked up by Season of Mist Records, where they would end up being on for quite a number of years, and would go back to the studio to record their second full-length, 6 years after De Mysterious, but finally released in 2000, we get Grand Declaration of War. Now, this is a very divisive album when it comes down to Mayhem's overall discography. You have a lot of people who love this album because of just how different it is from everything else. And then you have the group of people who hate it because of how different it is. This is definitely the most avant-garde album Mayhem ever did. Like, there's a lot of experimentation on here. But overall, this is my number 6 album. I do think it's pretty good. There are a couple of songs that are just kind of needlessly here, or songs where they get flat out electronic, which is really bizarre and like kind of off-putting a little bit. There are some off-putting moments on here, like songs that just almost cut out of nowhere, or just short songs that just did not need to be on here. But you do get some fantastic parts, fantastic songs like A Time to Die, Crystallized Pain, and Deconstruction. Like, I think those songs kick ass. But definitely the vocals definitely shifted. Like, there's not really much of the black metal scream on here. It's more like telling a story gruffly. Like spoken word in a gruff sense by Maniac, which I guess kind of fits with the whole war theme of this album, but I would have loved to have heard more proper vocals as opposed to just spoken word. So yeah, this album's definitely divisive. I think it's good musically for the most part, apart from some songs that are just needlessly here, or the electronic moments. I forget the name of the song where it's all electronic. But still, it's a good album. I don't think it's amazing, but it's not bad. It's solid for what it is. And it is my number 6. So moving on from there, 4 years go by before we get the next album, and released in 2004, we would get Chimera. Now, this album is a huge, huge step forward from Grand Declaration of War. This is my number 3 Mayhem album. I really like this. It's almost like they were trying to take a little bit of what they were attempting to do on Grand Declaration of War, but bringing back the classic black metal stuff from De Mysterious and kind of blend them together. And this is almost, I would dare say, almost it's progressive black metal, because you do get some proggy song structures to a lot of these songs. But starting off with the song Whore, which is straight up black metal insanity. My Death, which is just vicious and ugly and nasty and evil and brutal. And then the title track at the very end, where they get flat out doomy at times, like definitely showcasing songwriting maturity. And the production on this album is up there with some of the best sounding Mayhem material out there. So yeah, Chimera, my number 3. Now, after the release of Chimera, and after playing live at Wacken in 2004, which was a huge deal, which is also where the infamous interview gone wrong with Necrobutcher and Sam Dunn happened. But basically, Maniac was going through a lot of substance issues and was just kind of breaking down a little bit. So, they like to say they never kicked him out. They just felt like he needed to go to get his life together. So, in his place would be the return of Attila back in the band on vocals. And then they would go back to the studio, and then released in 2007, we get the album Ordo Adko. This album is my last place one. This is my number 8. For me, this album just felt like a giant non-event to me. Like, I was listening to this album and I got bored after quite a bit. And also, the production is very muddy. The mix is very much off. Like, the bass is almost non-existent at time. The vocal production I wasn't a big fan of. The guitar tone was alright, but it just... The thing that saves this album from being bad is Hellhammer's drumming. Like, Hellhammer plays his ass off on every release Mayhem has ever done, and that's what saves this album from being a bad album. I'm not saying it's terrible, but for me personally, this was the least memorable, and just, I almost fell asleep, honestly, when I was listening to this. Like, there were moments I just couldn't stop yawning. I honestly couldn't wait for it to end. So, yeah, I hate to say that about this album, but yeah, nothing jumped out at me about this album, and that's why it's my last place. But after the release of Ordo Adko, we would get more lineup shifts. They would have a guitarist here for a little bit, but not really worth going into. But then in 2011 and 2012, they would pick up 2 new guitarists, as Blasphemer would leave the band in 2008. But in 2011 and 2012, we would get the additions of Morten Iversen, otherwise known as TOMAHAWK, who came from 1349 and Gorgoroth. And then 2012, we get joined by Charles Hedger, otherwise known as Ghoul, who came from Cradle of Filth, which is very interesting to think that a Cradle of Filth guitarist would end up joining Mayhem. But this would be the lineup going forward, with Ghoul, TOMAHAWK, Necrobutcher, Hellhammer, and Attila. Still the lineup to this day. And they would go back to the studio, and then released in 2014, we get Esoteric Warfare. This album's better? It's my number 7 album. I do think it's solid for what it is. I do think there are some really good songs on here, like Psy War. Like, the first half kind of had peaks and valleys. The second half definitely picked up in terms of aggression and memorability to me. But still, this album feels like a much better version of Ordo Adko. which isn't saying much considering, like I said, Ordo Adko is my last place. But yeah, this album definitely had more. Ooh, excuse me. Definitely had more pizzazz going for it, but still there were a couple of songs that just did not quite grab me. But the majority of the album is good. Again, kind of goes back a little bit to the avant-garde side that was introduced back on Grand Declaration of War and what they were trying to accomplish with Ordo Adko, but they just didn't hit it for me. But here on Esoteric Warfare, they do hit better strides on here. It's just number 7 just because they had a couple songs that weren't the greatest, and also it just falls in comparison to so many other releases. So yeah, my number 7. But now we move on to the latest album in Mayhem's discography, released in 2019, around Halloween 2019, on Century Media Records, where they currently reside. We would get the release of Demon. This is my number 2. Holy fucking shit. This album's fantastic, like top to bottom. The production, it snarls once again. Like, this almost feels like De Mysterious Part 2, but with a little bit of moments carried over from albums like Chimera and Wolfslayer Abyss a little bit, but this is mostly straight up black metal. No more of the proggy avant-garde stuff that they were doing in the years since the late 90s. This is mostly back to the classic roots of Mayhem, but still kind of trying to... It feels like a more mature version of De Mysterious. But yeah, songs on here like Of Worms and Ruin, Worthless Abominations Destroyed. Like, holy shit, this album just feels evil and dark and misanthropic. And it just... And Attila's vocals, the best they've sounded since De Mysterious, in my opinion. Like, he's going all over the place with the dark opera stuff, the almost throat singing, the screams, even death growls come in here a little bit more. And even on, like, bonus versions of this album, something you would have never thought Mayhem would do, they covered a death song, which, if Euronymous, like, Euronymous would probably be rolling in his grave right now, knowing that Mayhem covered a death song, considering Euronymous, quote, hated death metal and hated death. So, but honestly, like I said, fuck you, Euronymous. And also, Necrobutcher is a huge death fan. So, fuck off, Euronymous. But yeah, they do a version of Evil Dead, and it's pretty solid. It's almost like a black metal version of Evil Dead, which is really, really cool. But yeah, this is my number 2, and yeah, feels like part 2 to an all-time classic. But yeah, that does it for my ranking of all things Mayhem. Sorry if it kind of came off a little bit jumbled. Again, my voice still not all the way the best, but I wanted to make sure I got to a deadline to do this ranking, but I definitely will be back to full swing with my voice here very soon. But this is the last discography ranking I'm doing for a little while. It's going to take April off, so the next discography ranking I'm going to do is going to be around mid-May, mid to late May. I'm going to be covering probably what's going to be the most difficult discography ranking, and ironically enough, my boys at the Thralls of Metal are going to be doing this next. Immolation. Oh man, it's going to be a pain in the ass having to rank a bunch of great albums, because I'm just going to go ahead and say it, they don't have a bad album. But in terms of how they're going to be ranked, you're going to have to find out here in a couple of months. So there you go with that. But anyways, thank you guys for watching. What is your favorite Mayhem album? Let me know in the comments below. And until next time, you people out there, keep your horns high and your dreams wet.